Hi beauties, so we're going to be doing a sew along for Vogue 9104. Go ahead and grab your fabric and turn it right sides together. Place your patterns on top with your pattern weights and cut around your fabric. Next you want to take your tracing paper and your tracing wheel and transfer all your markings from your pattern to your fabric. You should now have your front and your back armhole facing. Make sure you have them both interfaced. You should have two collar pieces with only one interface. You should also have your front and your back cut out as well. For the lower panels on the dress, you can choose a contrasting color as I have done, or you can choose the same fashion fabric as you have on the upper portion of your dress. Now you want to place your front pieces right sides together, and you want to place a pin at the very top of your dress and also at the notch. Place another pin along the lower portion of the dress and then continue pinning along the entire center front seam. Now grab your back pieces. If you forgot to transfer your marking for your center back opening, you can do that by just placing your pattern on top. Place a pin at the dot and then continue pinning along the entire lower portion of your back pieces. It's also a great idea to have both of these edges serged prior to doing this step. For the back piece, we're going to make sure we sew all the way up until our dot. Do not sew past the dot. This is for our back opening. Take your fabric to your machine and sew along the entire center front seam. Continue sewing your seam until you reach the end of your fabric. Make sure you backstitch very well. Then you want to take your fabric to your ironing table and press your seam open. Every time you sew a seam, you should press a seam. Moving on to your back, sew along the entire center back seam until you reach your dot. Remember, do not sew past your dot. Once you reach the end of your fabric, make sure you press it open. In the instruction booklet, it tells us to create a narrow hem at the back. Instead, I'm going to sew along the serged edge and I'm going to pivot and then I'm going to sew back up the seam, just like you see me doing here. Now we're going to create a gentle gather along the neck edge. To do this, use a basting stitch and backstitch at the beginning of your dot. Once you reach the opposite dot, do not backstitch. Instead, raise your presser foot and cut about 5 or 6 inches left of extra thread. This is going to be used to gather your neckline. Gently pull on the loose threads that you left hanging. You can use either the top threads or the bottom threads. This is going to create your gathers. Repeat the gathering step to both sides of your back neck. Remember, backstitch at the beginning of your dot and then do not backstitch at the end, leaving extra threads for you to create your gathers. Repeat this step 1/4 of an inch away. Do this to both sides of your back. Now we're going to pin the back of our dress to the front of our dress at the shoulders. Pin along both shoulder seams and then pin along the entire side seam. I like to start at the lower edge of my side seam and work my way up to the armhole. Sew across both of your shoulder seams with a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Repeat this step to both side seams as well, starting at the lower portion and working your way up to the armhole. Grab your collar piece. We're going to sew a 5/8 of an inch stitching line across the lower edge of your curved collar. This stitching line is going to act as a guide. Take your fabric to your ironing table and press that curved edge in along the stitching guide. So now you should have your dress sewn across the shoulder seam and across both side seams. Place your Preston collar above your unpressed collar right sides together, and we're going to pin across the upper edge of the fabric. Pin across both sides as well. Moving on to our armhole facings, grab your front and your back armhole facings and pin them right sides together, matching your notches. We're going to sew our collar piece starting at the lower edge of the side, and we're going to work our way up to the top, sewing across the entire upper edge, again using a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Make sure you pivot your fabric and sew back down that short side edge. Once you finish this step, you want to use your scissors and trim off about 3/8 of an inch of this fabric. That way you can get rid of some of the bulk. Sew your armhole facings using a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Do this to both of your armhole facings. Take your pieces to your ironing table and press them flat. For your collar, you want to turn it right side out, and you want to make sure you have your corner pieces nice and sharp. With right sides together, you want to pin your collar piece with the unturned in portion right sides together to your neck edge. Adjust your gathers to fit your collar and pin along the entire neck edge. Place your armhole facings right sides together, matching the seams and your notches. Pin along the entire armhole facing. My camera died shortly after this step, but just sew your armhole facing with a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, and also sew your neck edge as well. We're going to work on some understitching. Press your seam away from your armhole, and we're going to sew on the right side of the fabric, very close to the seam line. After this step, trim away any of the extra fabric that is left within the seam. Be very careful not to cut into your dress. In the pamphlet, it tells you to do this step prior to doing your understitching. This is just personal preference. I find it much easier to do this step after I've done my understitching. You should have also sewn your collar to your neck edge. Press the 5/8 of an inch seam allowance towards your collar. Next, press the folded edge of your fabric to meet your stitching line. I personally like to use this hem bond. I just find it much easier, but you can follow along with the instruction booklet for this step if you prefer. So I just cut a few small portions of the hem bond and sandwich it inside my fabric. Then take it to your iron and continue with the steps on the back of the package. To secure my armhole facings, I place it wrong sides together inside my fabric, and I stitch inside the seam line. Grab two of your lower front panels and place them right sides together. Pin until you meet your dot. Repeat this step to your back panel pieces as well. Your panels to your machine and sew until you meet your dot. Make sure you backstitch very well at this point. In a few steps, we're going to need to create a narrow hem. To make that step easier, I like to sew a 5/8 of an inch stitching guide along the hem edges. We've sewn the center front and center back panels to the dot. Place them right sides together along the side seams. Sew along the side seams with 5/8 of an inch seam allowance all the way across. If you've sewn the side seams, you're going to have something similar to this. I like to press in along the stitching guide to make my narrow hem easier. Place the raw edge of your fabric to meet the stitching line, then fold it in one more time. Once you folded in your narrow hem, you're just going to sew very close to the edge. This is going to encase your fabric and create your narrow hem. Alright beauties, so we're almost finished with this project. The very last step is to sew the lower panel piece to your upper portion of your dress. The easiest way to do this is to first match your side seams of your panel to the side seams of your dress, then continue pinning in to fill the spaces. Very last step is to sew this seam with a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Once you've completed that step, your dress is all finished. Go try on your fabulous dress and I'll see you guys in my next video. Bye guys.